Well, thanks. I guess I'll just start by thanking SPI for organizing such a wonderful conference, and thank all of my sort of fellow attendees for presentations and insightful conversations that we've had over the course of the last. Short anecdote that I think is going to illustrate the fundamental point of the experiment that I'm going to describe, and that was also the genesis of kind of thinking about the design. But first, the anecdote itself reminds me of an appearance that the comedian Louis Black made on The Daily Show in 2008. And this was during the sort of peak period of hyperinflation, when prices were doubling nearly every day. And he recalled an interview in Harare had conducted with a shopper. And the shopper reported that he had just paid $10 billion for a can of beans. And Louis Black's comment was, $10 billion for a can of beans? I didn't know they had Whole Foods in Zimbabwe. And so the anecdote is related to Whole Foods and the genesis of the project. And so I was in the checkout line at Whole Foods a couple of years ago. And as you may know, if you're a shopper there, the cashiers will occasionally ask you for donations, say to the Whole Kids Foundation, for example. And I really hate being asked at the checkout because I don't like the social pressure of being kind of buttonholed by someone I don't know. But in this case, the cashier asked me, and I said, okay, I'll give $5 to the Whole Kids Foundation. Then I walked out to the car and I was wondering, well, why did I decide to give this money this time? This isn't, it's, I say no, probably, 49 times out of 50. What happened this time? Was the cashier cute? No, not particularly, although all Whole Foods cashiers tend to be pretty cute. And then I realized that when I was in line getting ready to check out, I was flipping through my phone, and I got an email that said that a large and long-expected reimbursement from the university for an experiment I had conducted had finally been deposited into my account. And somehow, getting that reimbursement sort of changed the way I was thinking about whether I would want to make a donation or not. Now, were I a good neoclassical economist, or a good sort of if I was sort of normatively rational, the deposit of the check shouldn't have made any difference to me. I'm not particularly cash constrained, at least I wasn't at the time. I fully expected that maybe there was some doubt in my mind that the university would ever give me my money back, but I fully expected to get it. And so nothing about my real circumstances had changed. And so somehow there was a framing effect. I felt flush when I got the reimbursement. And so that sort of led to this experiment. And so in the experiment, I'm going to study a dictator game, which if you weren't familiar with dictator games at the beginning of the conference, I'm sure you are now, because we've seen many papers that use them. And so this is a setting in which an experimental subject has an endowment of E, and they're asked to choose an amount between 0 and E to give to another subject. Typically, most subjects will end up sharing something, and my sort of notional amount is that people maybe share about a quarter of what they get, although that of course varies. And so this game is a workhorse for studying social preferences. It's I can think about it as also as a sort of simplified version of an ask that a charity might make. And so recently, there have been a number of papers that have shown that the generosity that people exhibit in the dictator game when it has that very simple form that I just described isn't particularly robust. We can make some small changes that seem perhaps inconsequential, some maybe less so, that will cause giving to fall a lot. And so, for example, if we add an opt-out stage to the beginning of the game, where first you can just say, no, I don't want to play, or I want to play, and then you decide I'll give 0 to something between 0 and E, that reduces giving a lot. And so opting out is equivalent to saying I don't want to give anything. It really adds no additional, doesn't expand the choice space, but it leads people to give less. If there's some uncertainty that's introduced between the choice that someone makes and the payoff that the recipient might get, people are less generous. If you allow people to say, I'm going to tell someone else that this person is going to get $4, that will make them less generous. And it's also been long established that people generally tend to be more generous with income that they've received as a windfall rather than that they've earned through effort. And so, sort of thinking back to my experience at Whole Foods, you could think of my experience of the deposit into my account as a kind of windfall. And you can sort of look at this lack of robustness of the dictator game as a bug or a feature. So if you are sort of if you think what you want to do is study some very sort of persistent aspect of individual sort of cognitive makeup, maybe it's not so robust. But in its lack of robustness, its sensitivity to context, it can help us learn something about context. And so more broadly, both from a kind of individual cognitive point of view and kind of in the structure of the economy, our income gets labeled by source. We have different streams of income that are coming in. We have regular earnings. We have tax refunds. Sometimes we win things. Sometimes people give us money or gifts. If we're in a sales profession, we might get bonuses. We may front our own money for purposes for our employer and then get reimbursed. And so the question is, well, how does this labeling affect giving? And so thinking that when I was in line at Whole Foods, I had labeled, some portion of my income got labeled with the term reimbursement. And so neoclassical economics will say, a dollar is a dollar. It doesn't matter what label people might apply to different pools of income at different points in time. All the income should be considered in one big pool, fungibly, as is the term that we use, wherever it came from, and you make your decision sort of in a broad sense over all the purposes that you might have for your money, all the different sources it may come from, you reach a decision. Another theory is that these labels actually do matter, and that we don't fully, they are not fully fungible with one another. We don't fully adjust for the distribution of income across these different sources. And in particular, some sources seem to have uses that are more appropriate to them than others. And so we might interpret the earlier evidence on the dictator game kind of in that light, that earned income is more, windfall income is more appropriate for giving to others than earned income is. And so sort of starting from that point, what happens, when people have multiple sources of income to allocate to to giving when they have earnings and a windfall happens. How does that affect them? And also, do these multiple sources of income provide a similar kind of disconnection or indirectness or ambiguity between, do they introduce that into the decision frame in a way that people might exploit to be more selfish? And so that's what the experiment is going to address. And so the design is as follows. So I recruit a bunch of workers from the Mechanical Turk online labor market, which if you may not know, but it's a sort of clearinghouse for people who are willing to do small bits of work online in exchange for small payments, discrete tasks that might take anywhere from 30 seconds to an hour. And so I recruited people who were working in this market. I divided them into pairs of dictators and receivers. And in the course of the work that they did for me, they were accumulating some tokens that they would exchange for cash after the task was over. And so there were two parts to the experiment from the dictator's point of view. First, there was a random draw for windfall tokens. So they had an account that was filled with some tokens. And then they engaged in a task in which they were matching numbers. So they would see grids of 9 numbers, and they had to select the 2 numbers in the grid that sum to 100. They would do one of these. They would get a certain, so they would do one of these and then another would appear, and they would get a certain period of time to work on this task. And they would be paid based on whether they sort of performed better than the median performance based on a standard that I'd sort of set from previously from running a pilot study. And so we have sort of exogenous variation in this in earnings by randomly assigning different task durations to people. So if you work for longer, you have the chance to earn more. And also the sort of pay for performance dimension, where if you score more than the median, then you earn more than you would if you scored less. And the design allows me to sort of have people who have either earned most of their tokens by the end of the exercise, or won most of them. So people are randomized into cells that are indicated in orange here, and they might earn more, so earnings on the x-axis here, or earn less depending on their performance on the task. They might win more or less depending on a random draw. And so someone who is sort of earning 15 and winning 25 in expectation based on the cell they're assigned to might end up with a realized windfall in earnings of one of these 4. And so the green dots just indicate the actual realized combinations of windfall and earnings that people have at the end of the experiment. And you can see that some people will end up with a lot of windfall tokens and no earnings. Other people will end up with a lot of earned tokens and no windfall. And there will be people sort of in between in a fairly continuous way. And so what I'm looking at is, mixtures of income from earnings and windfall, and how does that mixture affect people's willingness to give? And so And so one thing that we should expect to see if the dictators sort of conform to the sort of standard assumptions of neoclassical economics is that say that someone has 30 tokens. It shouldn't matter whether they earned one additional token or had one additional windfall token in terms of how much extra they might be willing to give. So a marginal token, whether it comes from earnings or windfall, should have the same effect on giving. Yeah, 5. Thank you. And so once they've done their earnings and got their windfall, they see this screen in which they make a decision about how much they would like to give to their partner. The screen sort of shows, sort of reminds them, you might say, frames the decision in terms of the experience that they've had of earning or getting windfalls, and then they make a choice. The basic result, which is does not jump out, sort of very clearly in this analysis, but I'll show a much more detailed picture, is that, as we expected from the literature, people are more generous with windfall tokens than earned tokens. So a marginal windfall token, people give about 14% of it, only about 6% of a windfall token. But interestingly, when we sort of say, well, what happens when there's a mixture of tokens? When people are, say, 50% earned and 50% windfall, what happens? Mixtures tend to result in a sort of lower marginal willingness to give than at the extremes. And so this was a very interesting sort of hint to me about what was in the data. And then I did a more non-parametric analysis. And this is what I found. And so here are two graphs in which the fraction of tokens from earnings from all windfall to all earned is on the x-axis, and the marginal propensity to give a token is on the y-axis. And so what we see is that when people have mostly windfall, they're very willing to give a marginal windfall token, but they're totally insensitive to changes in earned tokens. And conversely, when people have mostly earned things, they're willing to give marginal earned tokens, but not very willing to give marginal windfall tokens. So what it looks like is that people are kind of paying attention to the size of the largest account they have, and that they're sensitive to changes in the size of the largest account, but insensitive to changes in the smaller one. Another way of looking at it is that it's almost as if they're not really doing the math right. It's as if, sort of in the middle, 30 windfall plus 30 earned tokens is less than the 60 that you would, that you sort of know is what their total is. They're behaving as if they have less. And so the framing of tokens from windfall and earned sources seems to have allowed people to selectively attend to one or the other in a way that makes them overall less generous. And so one of the sort of robustness or follow-ups that I did to this study was to ask, well, is it really the sources that matter, or is it sufficient to just throw two labels on different on different accounts, is that going to generate the difference? And the answer is no. So I had people get, they're given windfall tokens, they take a survey, and then their account is credited with some additional windfall tokens, and that doesn't really make a doesn't make a difference. The composition doesn't make a difference if everything is windfall into accounts. And so the conclusions of the study are basically that people are not treating these two accounts as fungible at the margin, and this provides some evidence for the use that sort of mental accounts matter in this kind of a situation. And also that, more particularly, that participants paid selective attention to the largest source, whether it was earned or windfall income. And I think that if I were to just sort of say what's the message sort of, say for practitioners from this kind of study, I think it's that the framing of people's resources when they're in the situation of having to make a choice can be quite important, and that people tend to, if they can find an excuse to be less generous, they will. And so I think the message is really about the sort of subtleties of framing in a charitable ask, if we're talking about practitioners. So, thank you.